If you're racing in Kona this year, listen up, this video is for you. We're going to chat through a few learnings from the island, from racing on the island over the years, some do's and don'ts, or even if you're just interested with it being on the weekend, you're going to watch the coverage, you might be aspiring to go to the race at some stage in your life. And I want to share some of my coaching, plus a little bit of physiology and science around nutrition, and some context around the heat. Factors to consider, which you don't have to necessarily change your strategy for race day, but more awareness. Okay, so some do's and don'ts around carbohydrates, understanding heat, the wet bulb concept, wet bulb temperature. What is it? We can learn how to use pacing strategies to preserve some of our carbohydrate stores and how that relates and interrelates to intensity on the day. Then you want to listen up to this, especially the uber strong bikers. You also want to know why everything unravels on the Queen K in terms of on the run, why everyone falls apart there. So let's get cracking. So let's look at this key area here, wet bulb temperature. I'm not going to go into too much detail. You can read more about that. In essence, it's the temperature, your relative humidity, and that's normally expressed as a percentage, and we add the solar radiation, so the strength of the sun actually beating down on you. This is something that's really not understood very well, certainly as an athlete back in the early years racing in Kona, and then developing into a coach the last sort of 3 years, having learned from some very clever people around this and done some heat training studies through Dr. Clues. We can start to understand that, for example, in 35 degrees with 90% humidity, we get a wet bulb of 32.5 degrees. Now, why is that important? When you go over 30 degrees Celsius, that can be very dangerous for the human beings to be exercising when the wet bulb, the WBT, is above 30 degrees. For example, if that was 35 degrees and 10 to 15% humidity, so dry heat, the WBT will be under 20 degrees centigrade, and those are easily worked out on a calculator. So generally Kona, by the time you get to the marathon, you're going to be having a real issue around evaporation. In essence, it's the damp air, the moisture in the air, causing issues with our evaporation, because we're very good at sweating, humans. So we can't do that when the air is wet very efficiently. Okay, so what are the other learnings that we've found from racing on the island? So you have a higher sweat rate, increased core temperature, and you'll see how these interrelate to carbohydrates, so bear with me. Skin temperature, higher demand for carbs when the intensity goes up. So you have some parameters that you have to work with, and the key here is pacing. Pacing will interrelate to all of those factors and mitigate the way you make choices, good or bad, around fueling. One way to get around the uncontrollable is to really use the amazing aid stations to help strategize with our cooling. If we can reduce the core temperature and the skin temperature, it has a direct correlation to your overall feeling and a drop in heart rate, because that goes up straight away with the heat. Now, yes, you would have done some acclimation and got used to this temperature. Most of us going to World Champs would have really prepared well, or you come from a hot environment. However, you might have paced and done all your training in moderate conditions and didn't realize that all these factors that the island throw at you on race day, which you might have only had 7 days to get used to, starts to really affect how you absorb the nutrition. Okay, so we're going to dive a little bit into that. We're not trying to change anything at such short notice, but it's more about awareness, which you then can take into race day. The run. Okay, so if you've been watching it or you've actually competed, most people come into bother on the Queen K on the run leg on the way out. Why is that? Well, multiple reasons. But if we're looking at the nutrition, it's generally down to mole absorption of the carbohydrates, so the fuel used during the bike leg, because we haven't paced it correctly. When you get super hot and you are struggling to cool down, the blood goes from the gut to the surface of the skin because it prioritizes cooling. Now, remember we spoke about the WBT, the wet bulb temperature. Evaporation is a real issue. So your body is struggling the whole time on the bike to cool down. And when we keep increasing our carbohydrate usage, there's a high chance that we're not absorbing the fructose glucose combination, if that's what we choose, and that generally can sit in the gut. And if we get our fluid, our water balance wrong, for example, we're trying to maintain some sort of homeostasis during the day with not enough sodium, Na. Remember, the sodium helps retain some of the fluid. It's very individual, the amount we lose in our sweat, but we all do lose sodium. Everyone agrees with that. So let's just stay on that page for a second. When we disrupt this homeostasis with fluid and sodium, we keep inputting exogenous carbohydrates, external carbohydrates into our system. No matter what your source is, we will be choosing some sort of carbohydrate, whether it's a semi-solid, a liquid, for example. We have to understand how this plays into the previous note I said about pacing and intensity. So generally speaking, majority of the people that have issues, it's a combination of heat and intensity. That stage of the day after lunchtime, you generally will have 80 to 90% humidity. And we know when we're running, there's an increased workload. We're just moving, there's a lot more to move around. So the heart rate will be higher. And if we go out too quick, because you feel amazing for 10Ks, 12Ks, you generally now increase the heat alongside intensity. And we know that at lower to medium intensities, the carbohydrate usage isn't that different. This is really important to note. But at high intensity, the carbohydrate is super high. Okay, so this is where we run out of energy on the Queen K. Okay, we blame training, we blame potentially going too hard on the bike, we blame travel, not going out there long enough. All these monkey chimps comes onto the shoulder, and we're just not respecting this and the understanding of carbohydrates. Now, you can't suddenly just take more carbohydrates on board. Remember, we're only as good as what we absorb. Generally speaking, up to 90 grams per hour of a fructose glucose combination. Everyone's individual. You would have tried and tested this over the last 6 to 8 weeks, so we can't change anything in the days leading up to it while you're watching this. However, we can take in consideration and respect the intensity of the heat in Kona. Now, you can carry this over to hot races around the world with humidity, whether you're an ultra runner, cyclist, or triathlete. In summary, nutrition in Hawaii, or Kona as we know it, comes down to a few key areas that perhaps you didn't actually think about. If you want a little bit more information, please just send me a DM. If you're an old school guy, just drop me an email. You can get it at the bottom of this video. Nutrition for Kona becomes a little bit more complex now that you've listened to a few of my takes on this. Pacing becomes even a bigger factor than it usually is in an Ironman, mainly for absorption of carbohydrates. Cooling strategies become the priority. If we can maintain a cooler ride, a cooler run, we can keep the core temperature down. Understand the carb demands, reference the higher intensity when you push out spikes, so that'll be on any climbs or trying to break away or be a hero. Leave your ego at the airport as soon as you land in Kailua, Kona. Park that. It's like no other Ironman before. You've got to respect it. And the whole day is simply about cooling management. Enjoy the big island. Aloha.